Welcome back, human geographers, for our final lecture from the Folk and Popular Culture chapter of our Cultural Patterns and Processes unit. Tonight we're going to be looking at two major topics, somewhat separated from one another. The first one we're going to be looking at is the cultural landscape and what kind of makes up that. We've mentioned it before, but now we're going to look at it in detail. And then we're also going to look at threats to folk culture. So let's get started. We're going to start out with describing what the cultural landscape is. Now, the cultural landscape, a couple different elements. We defined it as part of the culture region definition, where we said that, it's defined by specific culture traits and cultural landscape features. So now we need to know what the cultural landscape is. In addition, it should be noted, at least for us, it's also the title of our textbook. So let's look at maybe why that is. Okay, so a couple definitions to get us started here. First thing we have to start out with is cultural ecology, study of the interaction between culture and societies and the natural environment they occupy. And so when we go back to unit number 1, we created that spectrum, right? And we said that different cultures are going to interact with the environment in different ways, and they're going to perceive the environment in different ways. And so we created that spectrum of how people interact with the environment. The cultural landscape is the product of that interaction, all right? Depending on how they perceive the environment, how they interact with the environment, creates different cultural landscapes for us, all right? So here's the definition of the cultural landscape. It's a very important definition because if there were going to be an FRQ from this particular chapter, just folk and popular culture, I would think that the cultural landscape would be a very prime discussion point because there's so many different things that you can discuss with it. So please make sure that you put a big star next to cultural landscape because I really do think that is something, if I were an AP test writer, I would definitely be asking a question about this. So here's the definition. The visible imprint of human activity and culture on the landscape. The modifications to the environment by humans, including the built environment and agricultural systems that reflect aspects of their culture. So it's basically the product of how we interact with the environment. It says the built environment and agricultural systems. So let's go ahead and define the built environment. And as with all of these definitions, because basically this whole slide is just definitions, we're underlining. All right, the built environment is man-made surroundings. So going back to unit number 1, this is material culture. It's material aspects of culture. The man-made surroundings that provide the setting for human activity ranging in scale from personal shelters, so homes, things like that, to neighborhoods, to large-scale civic surroundings, so entire cities and things like that. It's the thing that we as humans build. So we take a look at all the stuff that we build in our agricultural systems and all the different modifications that we make to the physical environment that reflect our culture. That's the cultural landscape. And there's a lot of really neat things that we can do here. So the cultural landscape is the representation of the material and non-material aspects of culture. All right. Obviously, the material aspects are going to be things like the built environment, but the non-material aspects, the more enduring elements, metafacts, and sociofacts of culture are present here. So we're going to see those and how we interact with the environment and the importance that is placed on different elements and things like that. Okay. So we have to add in an additional definition here as well. And this is a term, you'll see a couple different variations of this. So it's the definition is sequential occupation. Please note out to the side that you may also see it as sequence occupancy. Sequence occupancy. So very similar root words, but slightly different. The use and modification of a place by successive cultural groups, so one group after another, reflecting differing cultural values, technologies, and social relations that together contribute to a cumulative cultural landscape. So when we take all of these elements together, that gives us the cultural landscape, but there might be contributions from group A over here, and then group B over here, and then group C back there. And all these different things kind of coming together to give us the distinctive layout of a particular place. And that's what that last point says, is that all of this together produces a unique cultural landscape. And the way that I always describe the cultural landscape to students is, I say, if I were to blindfold you and then just drop you off in a place, you take off your blindfold, how would you know where you are? You'd look at the cultural landscape. You'd look at how we as humans have interacted with the physical environment of this place to say, okay, where am I? And this is something that you could absolutely see on the AP exam, and I don't know how you might see it. So let me give you some examples of how we could use this. So over the next few slides, I'm going to be showing you images that come from UNESCO, and that is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And these are World Heritage Sites that have been recognized for their cultural landscape, the way that we have interacted with the physical environment. So as we go through each of these, I'm going to draw your attention to different elements and things like that. And this is how I could see this appearing on the AP exam. Again, if I were a test writer, I'd like to show students a picture and ask them to identify some unique cultural aspect. Where do you think this picture was taken, given some of the elements that you see in the image? So you have to be very, very observant in order to do this, all right? And so we're going to kind of walk through some of these. All of this information is coming directly from UNESCO. I include the links on the bottom. This is just a sampling, and it's a single picture from each of these. Many of these have just a tremendous amount of just absolutely beautiful pictures from these different areas, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background about each of these places. So the first one that we see here is Afghanistan. This is the Bamiyan Valley in Afghanistan. And the Bamiyan Valley was actually a Buddhist kingdom in present-day Afghanistan, so showing the extent of how far Buddhism spread. But on here, you can actually see elements of the Islamic period as well, and it is predominantly Muslim or Islamic now. And so that makes this a really good example of sequence occupancy. We can see the elements of different cultural groups, Buddhism, Islam, playing a role on this cultural landscape. But it should be noted that in 2001, the Taliban actually destroyed the two standing statues of Buddha in this particular valley. And it actually made international news when they did that, because this was a World Heritage Site. In Brazil, specifically in this case, Rio de Janeiro, one important element that you should probably look at when it comes to identifying cultural landscape features are landmarks. And in this case, you can see a very prominent landmark. This is Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro, which kind of overlooks the entire city of Rio and the bay upon which it sits. So that's a really good example to use, is natural landmarks, really identifiable landmarks in a particular area. This is an area in Canada, specifically Nova Scotia, where a group of people called the Acadians live. And the Acadians are actually descendants of French colonists, particularly on the eastern part of the country. And this shows a church, and it's likely a Roman Catholic church in Nova Scotia. And it is possible that they could ask you a question where you have to identify the likely place where a picture is taken. So we take a look at this, we can see the religious structure, and religion can present itself, and we're going to look at different symbols as far as religion is concerned as we go through this unit. And so we might be able to see, for example, the cross representing Christianity, and in this case, in Canada, Roman Catholicism, and we can make that determination. If you're very observant, you might have noticed what looks like the French flag flying outside of the church. Now, it's actually interesting to note because that's actually not the French flag, that's the Acadian flag, which uses basically the French flag as its kind of base. But the one really defining difference between the Acadian flag is a single 5-point yellow star that's on the blue horizontal bar on the hoist side of the flag. It's just a single 5-point yellow star. And that differentiates the Acadian flag from the French flag. Other than that, they are completely identical. This picture taken from Cuba, actually the Vinales Valley, which is a largely agricultural area. The one agricultural commodity that they especially focus on is tobacco. Once again, notice elements of the cultural landscape. Notice the human-made elements. Notice the architecture. Notice the cross on top of the tower. This would give us a little bit of indication about the type of religion in this area and might help us narrow down what part of the world we're looking at. This image is from Kenya, and this is looking at the Mijikenda Kayas on the coastal part of Kenya. And kayas are fortified villages in Kenya, and most of them have been abandoned. Most of them, I think, were abandoned in like the mid-20th century. But the villages still stand as sacred spiritual sites, and they're the sites of meetings and pilgrimages and things like that for different, in this case, likely animist groups of Kenya. In Indonesia, this is the Bali province of Indonesia, and we're going to take a look at Bali in class. And there's a lot of crossover between Hinduism in Bali, in a country that is predominantly Muslim. In fact, it is the world's most populous Muslim country. But Bali is predominantly Hindu and reflects migrations, particularly the Indian diaspora. But what I want to draw your attention to here is actually the agriculture. We mentioned agricultural systems as a defining element of the cultural landscape, and here you can see what is known as terracing. Please make sure that you write that down on this slide. This is an image of terracing, and typically we see terracing in areas where intensive wet rice farming is taking place. You can see the flooded fields there where the rice is being grown. And so that would help us to narrow down different parts of the world, because we typically only see terracing in certain areas, and when we can see that the terracing is combined with these flooded fields, that might help us to narrow down where we're looking at and where a particular type of agriculture is being practiced. Our next one is from Iran, and this is the Persian Gardens. And the Persian Gardens were intended to represent paradise on earth, or Eden on earth, and actually combines elements of Zoroastrianism, which is a long, just historic religion in what is now modern day Iran, as well as elements of Islam as well. And while this is largely based on Zoroastrianism, it should be noted that in many buildings that reflect Islamic culture, you're not going to see the human form or animal forms depicted. And there's certain level, kind of hierarchies as far as what is acceptable and things like that. God is not to be depicted. The Prophet Muhammad is not to be depicted. But really, it's any human form or animal form really shouldn't be depicted as far as Islamic culture is concerned. And even that is a bit of a generalization, because it tends to be more on the Sunni branch of Islam than compared to the Shia branch. So again, a bit of a generalization, but that's a general pattern that we tend to see. And so instead, you tend to see really elaborate geometric patterns, geometric shapes, colors, that will decorate and adorn structures in areas that are predominantly Muslim. And in fact, even though it's not present here, we'll talk about the expansion of Islam into the Iberian Peninsula and how some of the now churches that were mosques still have some of these elements of Islam as part of it. Again, a good example of sequence occupancy. In Japan, this particular World Heritage Site reflects the sacred sites in Japan that combine elements of Shintoism, which was is part of a really integral part of Shintoism, focused on nature worship and worshiping nature, and how Shintoism and Buddhism were combined. And so we notice the architecture there. In Madagascar, this is the Royal Hill of Amobamanga, and it was a sacred site for Malagasy people and was a place of worship. On this particular hill, several different holy places that include places like fountains, sacred basins and woods, as well as sacrificial stones. So these are different elements that are built into it. Notice also the climate, the physical environment that we could use to help piece together where this might be. In New Zealand, this particular area is Tongariro National Park, and this particular national park has it's a massive park, and is especially significant to the Maori people in New Zealand. And so we can see elements of that in this picture. Again, notice the architecture, notice the people themselves in this picture. And then finally, our last image that I wanted to show you guys is this one from Portugal. This is specifically the Porto wine vineyards in the Alto Douro region of Portugal. And we bring this up because, again, those agricultural systems, wines and vineyards and growing of grapes and things like that, is something that is very characteristic of what we call Mediterranean agriculture. So when you think of where a lot of wine, or places that are especially prominent for wine they tend to be areas around the Mediterranean, or areas that have very similar characteristics to the Mediterranean. So France and Italy and Portugal and Spain, as well as California. California actually has a very similar climate to the Mediterranean. And so where these vineyards grow shares some characteristics. And so if we were looking at a especially large vineyard, we might think to ourselves, okay, well, this is a form of Mediterranean agriculture, and where is Mediterranean agriculture practiced? And that's something that we'll discuss when we get to our agriculture unit. But this is the type of thought process that has to go through. And it's really a difficult exercise for anyone. It doesn't matter how long you've been doing this, because you have to be able to say, okay, what do I know? What do I observe? What do I know? And then try and piece that together to figure out what is the most likely place. And I would say that that is probably one of the most challenging aspects to this course and to this AP exam, but it's one of the most fascinating, because it's really a lot of fun to look at all these different places and look at the different elements of culture and agriculture and political systems and all these different things that go into shaping the cultural landscape. And so, kind of open your eyes to that. See the things that are out there, and take a look at why are they there? What led them to be there? And again, the question is, in identifying this, if we were to blindfold you and set you down in a spot, you take off your blindfold, how are you going to know where you are? That's really important. And that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit in the next section, which is about threats to folk culture. So we're going to shift gears now. So these are the 5 main threats to folk culture that we're going to discuss and look at each of these individually and talk about some different examples. So here we go. We've got foreign media imperialism, change of culture, loss of traditional values, placelessness, and environmental threats. Each of these is identified in our textbook, and then I just kind of take a little bit further to ask some additional questions or to give counterexamples and things like that. So let's start with foreign media imperialism. And a lot of times we have to talk about pros and cons because, again, when we talk about threats to folk culture, obviously these are things that put folk cultures in jeopardy of remaining uh, their kind of traditional selves. But are there pros with that go with this? Well, almost always there are. It's never as black and white as it seems. So we have to kind of understand that. But here are some of the things that are identified as things that could put folk cultures in jeopardy. Okay? And the fact that just a small handful of countries control most of the media that is presented globally is something that could put folk cultures in jeopardy, particularly the United States, especially for the Americas, the UK for Europe and Africa, and Japan for much of Asia, are countries that control the dissemination of media and information. And so a lot of times the values that are presented by these countries, Western countries, may not exactly match up with the values of LDCs. And this is where we have to mention this concept of ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is evaluating other cultures based exclusively on the perspective of one's own culture. And anytime you're talking about another culture and you go, well, that's weird. Why did they do that? That's a bit of ethnocentrism, and it's something that happens a lot, and it's just something that we have to be aware of. We have to be aware that when we're talking about another culture and it's not something that we're used to seeing or used to doing, we just have to kind of take a step back and go, okay, let's not judge that based on our values, but let's try and understand, okay, why do they do that? What's the significance of that? What's the importance of that in that culture? And try and understand why that's an important element, whatever it may be. Whatever those values may be, whatever that practice may be, we want to be able to take a step back and say, okay, let's try and understand it from their perspective rather than judging it from ours. Now, as a counterexample to foreign media imperialism, we should mention the Al Jazeera News Network, which is a fairly recent addition, especially here in the United States. And Al Jazeera is headquartered in Qatar. And this is a counterpoint to just a small group of countries, particularly MDCs, that control most of the media. This is in an area that would be labeled an LDC. And so this is a counterexample to that. And it's just a different news network. That's all it is. It's just a different news network. In much the same way that in the US we might see CNN or Fox News. In the UK we would see BBC. It's just another news network, Al Jazeera. The next one is change of culture. And when cultures start to interact, we start to see cultures change. And the last two lectures ago, we mentioned the difference between assimilation, acculturation, multiculturalism, and let's go ahead and add on there syncretism, because that's important to understand as well. And basically, anytime new cultures interact with one another, we're going to see things tend to change. Now, when folk culture and popular culture come together, a lot of times the popular culture remains or maybe adapts a little bit and might take from the folk culture. But a lot of times the folk cultures may blend together, they may disappear entirely. And obviously that's more of a threat to folk culture than it is to popular culture. Two lectures ago, I mentioned the Amish and how a cultural practice in Amish communities where young Amish individuals will leave the community, go out, learn something, and make the decision to come back has actually been taken and used as a popular culture TV show. I think there are actually several of them, one of them being called Breaking Amish. And that's an example of the popular culture using this folk culture trait. And, the question is, which one is in greater danger of disappearing when those cultures tend to interact? And folk cultures tend to be the ones that change more, and we tend to maybe see a little bit more assimilation as a result. Loss of traditional values, our textbook talks about the role of women. And this is something that very much has kind of two different sides to it and can be very controversial. So I want to make sure that we mention the two different sides of this, all right? Because especially in MDCs and LDCs, we tend to see differences in the way that genders interact. Many times in MDCs, we see greater gender equality. Though, to be clear, the United Nations has actually studied it and said that there are 0 countries on Earth that have actually achieved true gender equality. The United Nations came out a couple years ago and said 0 countries have achieved that. And there's actually some measurement tools that we'll look at later this year to objectively show how they came to that determination, because we don't want to just say stuff and not have the facts behind it. So when we get to our development unit, we'll actually look at the facts behind that. And then in LDCs, a lot of times we see gender roles, and a lot of times when there are gender roles, especially in patriarchal societies, women are placed in subservient roles. And so as MDCs spread popular culture values like gender equality, that tends to open up more avenues where women can seek education and employment and things like that. And we know that when that happens, there's a greater level of development that's associated with that. We see birth rates tend to fall as education improves for women. There's economic benefits when women are in the workforce. And so those types of things happen as well. But as our textbook points out, many times there can be exploitation of women that take place as well as popular culture values are spread. And so again, there's that double-sided, double-edged sword of losing traditional values, but there's other negatives that come with those positives, and how do we balance that to ensure that traditional values are preserved, but without being at the detriment of half a population. And so it's a really tricky situation to be in. So a couple different elements to talk about objective data here. So a couple years ago, the Washington Post did an article about gender and folk clothing styles. And this is a visual from the article. You can see there's the link down there at the bottom if you wanted to read the entire article. And so they asked several people in predominantly Muslim countries like Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and they asked them, what style of dress is appropriate for women in public? And they had 6 different options there. Okay? And people voted based on what they thought was appropriate. And what we can see is, and this is an important element to understand, is that these countries are predominantly Muslim, but the degree to which different countries agreed on what was considered appropriate, it ranges dramatically. And so that's an important element to understand, is that when it comes to things like folk clothing styles, there isn't a consensus even within regions that are part of the same religion, because there's a lot of variations and a lot of different perspectives, and so local tastes will help to influence, in this case, what people see as appropriate. And so there's a project called the Women's Stats Project that looks at different elements of what we've been talking about, whether it's clothing styles, in this case, required codes of dress for women in the Islamic world. And so this is a choropleth map looking at, kind of what is considered, again, appropriate, just a different perspective on this, and different levels of how covered a woman needs to be, whether it's a veil, whether it's, and kind of the perceived or actual reaction to that. And so that's looking at dress code for women. The next one looks at discrepancy in secondary education. Again, secondary education is going to be typically middle school and high school. And this looks at, is there a discrepancy? We can see that green represents little discrepancy in secondary education, whereas the red represents greater levels of discrepancy, that fewer women are in secondary education compared to men. And so we can see differences there. And so gender and traditional values is something that has an influence, and folk culture is a part of that. But obviously we know that some of these elements are important to change, like getting women into secondary education or getting girls into secondary education. And in fact, there was an article a couple years ago about this historic shift that Saudi Arabia was going through. And in this case, it's an article called "In Historic Shift, Saudis to Allow Some Girls Sports." And it's an article about allowing girls to participate in sports in school. And this was something that was a dramatic shift from what had been practiced up to this point. And again, this is that changing of traditional values and how controversial it can be, because a lot of times we say, well, when we're talking about threats to folk culture, the loss of traditional values, and we might think, well, we don't want traditional values to go away. But then when we hear what some of the traditional values are, it becomes a little bit more challenging. We're like, wait, the traditional value is that fewer girls participate in sports or participate in school or whatever it may be. But also, we have to be concerned with the concept of ethnocentrism, judging another culture against our own culture, or using our cultural values to judge another culture. And so this is a really, really, really complicated discussion. And to say that there's only one right answer would probably be disingenuous. It would probably be wrong to say that and wrong to suggest that. It's a really complicated topic, and it's hard to come up with a single answer for that. The next threat to folk culture is what we are going to call placelessness, right? Or a term that we will use later in the year called uniform landscape. And placelessness is essentially this concept that every place looks the same. So here's the definition: the loss of uniqueness of place in the cultural landscape so that one place looks like the next, also known as uniform landscape. So again, the term itself kind of suggests that every place looks the same, right? That you can't differentiate one place from the next. And again, we use the example of if we were to drop you off blindfolded in a particular place, you take off your blindfold and you look around, how do you know where you are? And if when you look around, all you see is McDonald's and the Apple logo and Starbucks and Hilton's and all these different types of things, well, how will you know where you are? Because every place starts to look the same. And so that's where things start to become a little bit more complicated. And obviously, this is a threat to, folk culture, because if we go back to all those cultural landscape images that we looked at earlier in this lecture, and we started taking out some of those really defining characteristics, like the architecture, like the landmarks, like the types of agriculture, and just replaced it with everything that looks the same, that's placelessness. And that's certainly a threat to folk culture. Because all of those things tend to be more popular culture. They're all coming from MDCs, and they're all associated with more like popular culture elements. Final thing that is a threat to folk culture is the changes to the physical environment. Because folk culture tends to be very dependent on the environment. Remember when we defined last lecture all the different things that are important to folk culture? A lot of times it's tied to what's locally available. It's tied to the physical environment of the area. And when we looked at all those cultural landscape features earlier this lecture, there were a lot of really unique areas that were tied to the physical environment. Well, a lot of times popular culture produces a lot of pollution. A lot of times they're urban areas, so we're not seeing the physical environment as much. We're not seeing as much green space. They're not dependent on the local environment because, when we talk about building construction, they're building buildings with materials that aren't locally produced. And popular culture much more likely to modify the physical landscape. And to drive that home, we can take a look at golf. Now, our textbook talks about it, so I'm not going to go into the details about all of that. You can see that there to the side. What I want to draw your attention to are some of the maps that we've included. Let's bring this back home because you can see the image in the bottom right there shows a golf course in the state of Nevada. This one is specifically in Mesquite, Nevada, which is about an hour and a half outside of Las Vegas. And does this look like it's part of the natural landscape? No, of course not. But we have a lot of golf courses here in the state of Nevada, and more specifically here in Las Vegas. All right, taking a look at these maps, we can see that there are quite a large number of golf courses here in the state of Nevada, and this is something where it requires a massive amount of resources in order to do this because our natural environment is not conducive to these golf courses. And so the amount of water, the amount of whether the fertilizer, all these different things that go into making this possible is massive, and it's modifying the natural environment, it's modifying the natural landscape in a way that isn't natural. And as far as folk culture is concerned, it takes up a massive amount of land and modifies that land. And so anytime you're talking about modifying the landscape, whether you're talking about, in this case, golf courses, or we're talking about drilling, whatever it may be, if it's modifying the natural landscape, could that be endangering or threatening local folk culture? And it really obviously depends on the situation. But anytime you're modifying the natural landscape for a group that heavily depends on that natural landscape, that could put them in danger. And that is the end of our folk and popular culture unit. I will see you guys back in class to finish this discussion and the application of this information. I'll see you in class. Have a good one.